My new book, Pillars for Life, A Guide to Spiritual Ethics and Practice, is now out and available for you to read and purchase. You can check out our website, willowhealing.org, to find a link, or you can find it on Amazon. We look forward to getting your feedback, and if you love it, please leave a review and share with your friends. Now it's time for the show. Welcome to Willow Healing Matters, the podcast. We are so excited to have you joining us on this journey where we explore different ways to empower your soul, whether it's healing in your kitchen or all the way up in the corporate world. Come with us as we look into different ways to heal your mind, body, and soul. Hey everyone, it's Catherine Cristani with another episode of Willow Healing Matters, and today I am joined by the lovely Dr. Liz DeBetta. She is a scholar, artist, activist, trauma-informed educator, and founder of Migrating Toward Wholeness, a narrative healing methodology for adoptees, trauma survivors, and marginalized communities. Blending creative writing, performance, and social justice, Liz creates spaces where storytelling becomes a catalyst for personal and cultural transformation. Her award-winning solo show, Othered, and her book Adult Adoptees and Writing to Heal amplify silenced voices and reclaim narrative agency. Liz believes that healing happens when we reclaim the stories that were taken from us and that every voice matters. And a big welcome to the show, Dr. Liz.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here.
And I actually love this so much because I used to own a speech language pathology company, and our motto on our signs was communication is a basic human right. And the fact that you're promoting like every voice matters, it's so important and so needed to be spoken about in the world.
It's so true. We all have a voice and we all have a story to tell, but so many of us, because of so many reasons, have been silenced either by culture, either to keep ourselves safe, and sometimes the silence does keep us safe, but it becomes a burden over time when you can't use your voice and you don't know, you don't actually have agency around that. And so that for me, that's been a huge part of my own healing journey, is just finding and using my own voice and now be helping other people to be able to do the same.
100%. So what led you to need to do this? I guess the biggest thing, and needing to share your story.
Yeah. So I would say, I think the biggest thing was that I felt stuck. I hit a point about a decade or so ago where I just felt stuck. Like I had hit a wall. I needed something to shift, something needed to change. And I wasn't sure what it was, but I had just gotten out of another really unhealthy relationship, and I had gone back to therapy, and I was seeing the same therapist that I had seen for many, many years, about 15 years at that point, off and on. And every time I left a therapy session, I felt worse than when I went in. And I thought, okay, this isn't helping me, and this is supposed to make me feel better and it's making me feel worse. And so maybe something else is going on. And so I sort of started to do some of my own, like what I call my own, like I had to come to Jesus with myself, right? Where I was like, okay, something's happening. I feel stuck. I just got out of this, really terrible relationship. Again, I recognized that I had this pattern of choosing these really unhealthy relationships. And I knew that if I didn't figure out why I kept doing that, I was never going to move forward in my life. I was never going to meet someone and have an actual like partnership, right? Like the kind of relationship that I really wanted. And so it was around this same time that I had the opportunity to go back to school and finish the last 2 credits of a master's degree that had been sort of hanging out for many, many years because of an unhealthy, my first really, well, not my first, but a major, really unhealthy relationship, which was with my ex-husband. And I took a class in autobiographical writing, and I didn't need to take the class, but because I had been out of the program for so long, they were like, hey, you should maybe take this class. It might be good for you to be back on campus, a little bit while you're finishing up the other 2 credits of independent study. So I thought, oh, that sounds cool. Okay. And it was in that class that I was invited to write about being adopted. And it had never occurred to me that that might be the thing that I needed to interrogate in my life. Because up to this point, I just thought that all of my relationship problems and all of my unhealthy patterns and this feeling of stuckness was just related to something else, right? But I had never really thought about the impact of adoption on my
Yeah.
life until one night in class, when after many, many weeks of struggling to figure out what I was going to write about for the long personal narrative that was the point of the class, one of my classmates wrote a story about her sister, and she was sharing her draft of the story, and I just sat there crying because she was describing how much alike they looked and how similar their mannerisms were, and that they could share clothes. And as an adoptee, I had no idea who I looked like. I had no idea if I had siblings out there. I had no idea what it was like to look at someone else and see myself reflected. And I just lost it. And my classmates were all like, "Are you okay?" And my professor was like, "Are you okay?" And I was like, "Well, no, I don't think so." And I said, and they said, "What's going on?" And I told them, "Well, I'm adopted. I have no idea what this experience of looking like another person is." And my professor was like, "Why don't you write about that?" And it was that seemingly simple invitation that sort of cracked open a whole bunch of things, because I struggled to figure out what my story was at that point, because what I kept doing was telling the story that I had been told my whole life, right? The story that my parents had told me about why I was adopted. And I had to figure out my story. What was Liz's story? And the way that I got into it was by going back to some of my early poetry from my teenage years and using that as a way in. And it was really, very much because as I said, I felt stuck. I felt like something needed to shift. And the thing that helped me start to shift it was starting to figure out how to tell my own story. And then a couple of years later, I realized that there was some real power in that as I continued on to get my PhD.
Yeah, and thank you so much for sharing that, Dr. Liz, because it is such a powerful reflection. And so many points you brought up there, that so often we get told the story of who we're meant to be rather than discovering it for ourselves. And I can't say that I'm an adoptee, but it would definitely be a different process because, like you said, you don't know who your family is, you don't know who you look like, you don't know any of those points that we attach to our identities that we use to help form who we are. Like we say, I've got my sister, she just steals my clothes, it looks like exactly as you were saying. And I can relate to that because my sister used to steal my clothes so often, so, and also the fact that everyone has a unique story. And so often this is what people go, oh, like there's 100 coaches or there's so many people doing what I do, but it's your story that makes you unique and no one has the same story as you. And I love that poetry that you wrote as a teenager helped open up that kind of gateway to that healing of stuckness, because it was almost for me when you were sharing that, I was like, oh, the stuckness is because you had no idea who you were. No, were never told. You were just told who you had to be. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. Yes. Thank you for saying that. You may be the first person that has ever articulated it that clearly and that concisely, but it's 100% true. Yeah, like clearly I was stuck because I didn't know where I came from, right? And I couldn't move forward because I didn't know who I was, and that's on a lot of levels. Like, I didn't know who I was ethnically, biologically. I didn't know who I was intrinsically, really, because I had been shape shifting my whole life to try to fit in. And this is true for many adopted people, that, we call it the chameleon syndrome, right? That we become chameleons and we kind of learn how to fit ourselves into whatever environment we find ourselves in. And that's a survival strategy. And it's really great for a while, but over time it starts to break down. And then which is what happened to me. I realized I had all these survival strategies and none of them were working anymore. And I had to start doing that deep inner work to figure out who I was and why I was stuck. And it was because I needed to know my story from my perspective and tell it in my own words.
Yeah. And I could imagine it would be even trickier, doing what you do with the trauma work and that sort of thing, because you don't know what the traumas were. like you have the trauma of actually being given up for whatever reasons. That is a
Hmm.
trauma in itself, right? That you have to work through and all the attachment things that come with that. But then what happened before that and what happened to your parents whilst, you were in the womb and everything like that. People discount that so much, but it plays a massive part energetically on us.
Percent, yes. It's so good to talk to somebody who speaks my language and like really gets the core issues here, because we don't talk about it enough, and people get, like, oh my God, trauma. Like we're not going to talk about it. But it's true. Like the maternal separation is part of the trauma. Yes. And it's a pre-verbal trauma, which is part of where the stuckness comes from too, because that just ends up living in your body and in your nervous system until you do something with it, which is where the creativity plays a really important role, because then we're starting to move some of that out of our body and onto a page or onto a stage, as I did with my show Unmothered. But then there's also that epigenetic trauma that we're not talking enough about. And so having those layers and then being like, almost 40 years old and first starting to deal with them, or in the case of so many of the other adoptees that I'm fortunate to know and work with, these, we're all adults. Some of them are in their 50s and 60s before they start to figure out that they need some deeper healing and that they need some support. And it's crazy to me that we are not talking about this as much as we should. And it's a deeply uncomfortable subject.
It is, and it's funny because I interviewed someone many episodes ago, but he was sperm donor child, and he had no idea, and no one said anything
Yes.
until like much later, and it caused him to go into this identity shift because we don't realize how much of who we are we actually base on where we came from, and we do as much as you can shed those as you evolve in life. Like you said, you shed those chameleon layers and things like that. You still don't have that foundation and that groundwork to anchor back into and go, oh yeah, this is where I came from. And it doesn't mean that you had an unstable home or your parents weren't loving. It's nothing they've done. It's just intrinsically we want to know where we came from, and we want to find our roots and where we were originally planted as a seed.
Yes, 100%. And that's really important too, because that's a constant conversation that I still have with my parents, who are in their 80s now. That that they don't recognize the difference between the external and the internal needs. And so, like, I had a very loving family. I had a very, stable, loving home, excellent upbringing, lots of access to education and all the things, right? But internally, I was a confused mess. And I carried that with me, but couldn't ever talk about it until I was an adult and started to realize that all of the issues, and I put that in quotes, but really all of those issues that I had been having for decades were related to this lack of a fixed identity.
Yeah. Yeah. And not knowing where your roots were, right? It's just
Mm-hmm.
like, you knew where you grew as like, if we do a garden metaphor, you knew where the seed sprouted and how it turned into a tree, but you have no idea what's going on underneath, which makes it really hard to understand when you feel unbalanced or swayed because you don't know how deep your roots are going.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I love that you've taken this, I want to say pain. I always talk about this, drive your pain and passion into a purpose. But this is exactly what you've done, because now you've created this beautiful community, I guess, with like migrating toward wholeness and allowing that for a place where people can come and start to dive deeper into this journey.
Yeah. It really came out of me figuring, like, as where we started this conversation, figuring out that I did have a story to tell and that it was important and that people needed to hear it, because about a year, not quite a year after I wrote that first story, I won an award for it. Maybe 6 months later, I won an award for it at a Writing for Social Change conference. And I thought, oh, cool. Okay. And then I decided to continue on and get my PhD at 40 years old. Again, a much later in life decision. I have not had a straight path by any means. And there's a lot of good in that. But there's also a lot of like the stops and starts of that unfixed identity and the not knowing. And so much of my life I spent trying to be a version of myself and then, trying something else or doing something different and never really quite landing on a thing. And then when I decided to get my PhD is when I really sort of started to understand the power of the creative tools that I had been using my whole life. And so Migrating Toward Wholeness really came out of my desire to understand myself and rewrite my own story. And then realizing in that process there, I could help other people do the same thing, right? And that there are millions of people out there who need a deeper level of support and healing than they're getting from other more traditional modes of therapy. Because like I said, I spent 15 years in therapy. We never talked about adoption. Never came up.
I'm sorry, but that's just like, it's amazing.
No,
It
it's
it
okay.
it just kind of highlights the mismatch in diving deeper into the causes of things in traditional talk therapy, because so often they keep people talking about the current situation, but they don't peel off the underlying layers to get to the cause, which then actually just leaves people in a trauma loop because they keep talking about the same situation again and again, but not actually going, where's the questions there to get to that deeper level?
Yeah, exactly. In fact, in Unmothered, one of the lines is, I spent 15 years in therapy. We never once talked about adoption. Instead, we talked about my family as if it were just like any other family. And the mother we spent so much time talking about was the wrong one.
Yeah. Yeah.
And like these are all
Yeah.
like realizations that I came to as I was digging into my own story and my own internal experiences and realizing that I needed some healing, and I knew that I could get there using the tools that I had already learned and had been using for many years, which were writing and performing. But it's crazy to me how traditional talk therapy is still so prevalent when
Mm.
there's research that says that that does not help people with trauma. But I'll go back to what we were talking about earlier, which is that we're also not recognizing that adoption is trauma and that maternal separation is trauma. Like there's no
Yeah.
there's no argument there like that. And so we
Yeah.
need other modalities in order to get at those deeper layers, as you say, because trauma lives in our bodies, especially when it's pre-verbal trauma. And so the talking, as you said, gives us that, becomes just a negative feedback loop. And we're just kind of recycling the same things. But then our nervous systems and our bodies keep recycling the same things if we don't learn how to process it differently.
Mm. Mm. And I feel that that's such an important thing. It's because, until we look at things from a different perspective, it's really hard to shift the story that you're in.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's one of the core principles of Migrating Toward Wholeness is rewriting the truth. And it's about shifting our internal narratives and reframing all of those stories, especially in adoption, right? So adoption is a narrative driven culture. And so many of the stories that people like to hear are stories that are being told about adoptees, but not
Mm.
by or for adoptees. Part of the work too is shifting those narratives both internally and then by extension externally, because when I can tell a different story about myself and then I can tell that to somebody else who can actually hear that, then that starts to shift those dominant narratives that have been in place for so long that sort of gloss over the loss and the grief and the trauma that is at the core of this lived experience.
I feel that's such an important point because it is glossed over. And so often we get stuck in that this is how we were taught and this is how it was supposed to be. And, oh, but I was adopted. I could have been left in an orphanage, like it's almost like you're meant to be grateful for that. But at the same time, you are. But there's also this conflict happening on the other side. And I fully love that you've created that now. It's to migrating back to wholeness because it is coming to terms with that. It's not that you're saying I'm ungrateful for being adopted or being an adoptee. It's I am grateful for that. However, I've still got all this trauma from where that came from.
Exactly. It's the both and, right?
Yeah.
And what happens so often in, many cultural narratives is that people want things to be black and white because it's safe, it's easy, they don't have to think too hard about it, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
They don't have to consider the gray areas, except it's not possible. Like you lose the nuance when you think that way. And so remembering that there's a both and, like, I can both be grateful and hold grief. And I do, right? And that sort of grateful narrative is one of the big ones that we have to grapple with, because like adoptees are expected to be grateful and shut up and not talk about our pain and not talk about the truth of our internal experiences, which is that our lives began with loss. And if we're not given the appropriate ability to grapple with that loss and to articulate it, then you end up, as a statistic, and the rate of suicide among adopted people is significantly higher than it is in other populations. And there's some new research coming out by some adoptee colleagues here in the US that's so far preliminarily is suggesting that that number is about 36 times higher than non-adopted people. And it's pretty close to the same for first mothers who have relinquished their children. And so, like, that's a public health crisis as well.
We don't talk about those. No, 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 no,
No.
no, no. We don't talk about that. No, we do. We do on this show. I guess the biggest thing there is such, but to me, it makes sense only because of what the work, I feel the work I do and what I've seen, because I do so much intuitive work, and it's the energy underneath things that people discount so much. Like people will talk about mindset, but mindset only makes up 20% of how you move forward in life. And it's that underlying energy. And like you said at the start, there was just this feeling you were stuck and you didn't understand why, because you didn't know how to ground and feel safe in yourself. It's like almost that base chakra, that base energy, that root energy. There was no safety, because the whole point of, when you're born, you expect your parents to love and protect you. And even though they might have, put you up for adoption for whatever reason, even if it's for we couldn't look after you at that time, if you don't have the answers to that, that doesn't make you feel safe. So then if you're not feeling safe and constantly on edge all the time, how do you feel safe in yourself, and how do you want to go through life? Life is full of triggers all the time. And if you don't have that basic understanding, like you said, of where you came from and who you are, and that identity rooted in, your family, then where do you go to move forward? Like, even if you have a family that was shit family childhood, that that's where you came from and you can choose to step out of it. But as an adoptee, you don't get that choice. That choice has been taken away from you from the very start. So how do you work with people now to help them share their story and really get to the base of that trauma, so that they do feel like they belong, and so that suicide ideation doesn't become a reality?
Yeah. So I work one-on-one and in small groups and like group coaching settings with folks. And the Migrating Toward Wholeness process has 5 core principles. So the 5 core principles in Migrating Toward Wholeness are making space to heal, rewriting the truth, expressing the core or primal wound, becoming the subject, and breaking silences. And so all 5 of these, the graphic itself is a circle because it's a cyclical process. And we're always engaged in any or all of these at the same time. But the entry point really is making space to heal, because each of these 5 core principles are connected to the 7 parts of trauma healing as I define them in this process, and in the experience of being a person who has lived with a significant amount of embodied trauma. So the concept of making space to heal is that first step into honoring myself, right? Or the people that I work with honoring themselves and being really curious about what's going on, what's stuck, right? As I said, I came to this work because I felt really stuck, and I realized that something needed to shift, something needed to move. And this is the emotional piece of trauma healing, is that we start to get curious about, express, and release those things that are stuck. And that literally makes space in our bodies. It makes space energetically, as you say. It makes space for joy. It makes space for us to learn to feel what we're feeling instead of getting overwhelmed by it, so that we can then move into the next part of the process, which is rewriting the truth, right? Rewriting the stories that have been given to us in a way that feels truthful for us, so that we're working on the cognitive piece of trauma healing, which is helping to shift the internalized narratives and beliefs that have kept us stuck, that have kept us small, that have kept us unsafe, right? And I love that you talked about that feeling of unsafety in our bodies, because that's That was a huge part of my experience, just never feeling safe in my body. But it wasn't something I understood until I wrote Unmothered. And then literally one of the lines is, I have never felt safe in myself. And actually, the opening of the show is adopted people don't feel safe in our bodies, because we learned before we had words to remember that no amount of love could help heal the wound that makes us want to flee our bodies in any way that we can. And so this takes us into the expressing that core or primal wound part of the process, because that's the embodied piece of the work and the embodied piece of trauma healing, that we're starting to look at what's coming up in our writing, right? Our writing and our shared storytelling, and tuning into and processing those implicit memories that are attached to that pre-verbal stuff that has just been hanging out. And realizing that we can feel where that lives, and we can pay attention to it, and we can express it, so that we can move into the identity and integration piece of trauma healing by becoming the subject of our own story, which is the next part of the Migrating Toward Wholeness process. Because as adoptees, and for most people that have histories of trauma, that we have been the object in the story. And so doing the work of becoming the subject and shifting that orientation so that we have agency and ownership is really important, because then we're attending to the identity and integration piece. And we've talked a lot about identity in this conversation, you and I, how figuring out who I am, where I came from, accepting all of the parts of me and my story. And it's what I call like letting big me take care of little me, right? Because little me's still there, and little me shows up really scared and afraid all the time. But if I can let big Liz take care of little Liz, then I'm the author of my own life. And all of this work is really about breaking silences. So this whole process, and the fifth core principle is about breaking silences, because so many of us have been conditioned to stay silent about our internal experiences, partly because we may not have had the appropriate language to talk about them. And so the writing process that I do with folks in one-on-one coaching or in the groups is really about beginning to attend to the relational piece of trauma healing, which is creating a deeper connection to ourselves and others by putting language to our experiences, by saying the things that we have never been able to say in a safe container.
Yeah, and it's such a powerful reminder, like, that we need to, find the words to get it out, because so often even our body will store pain because our body doesn't know another way to express itself. So it's when you can actually be curious about that and tap into it that you can go, oh, okay, here's some words to put to that, and especially as a baby, you don't have the words to describe, like, why didn't you just love me? Like, it's just, why would you do that? So rude. You don't have those words. You don't have the words. And
no,
it's such a powerful process what you shared, because every element that you were sharing of your program made me just think of the word courage, because it takes courage to do that. Courage from whatever led to your adoption, courage to, to come back to yourself, to ask the questions that no one wants to answer. It all comes back to finding that courage to speak up.
Yeah. And for so many people, because of closed records and, sort of this secrecy and shame that is attached to being adopted, we will never get answers to some of those questions. And so the Migrating Toward Wholeness process is really about being okay with what we do and don't know, because we are able to get to a place of, this is my story in my own words, and I now have language to attach to all of my internal experiences, and I can continue to work with my nervous system when things get activated, and I can use the writing process that it's a writing process that I teach people, and we use 3 kinds of writing interconnectedly and interchangeably to get at all of this stuff. And it's really, it's dependent on what people bring, right? So it's not like, and yes, I do have programs that have set prompts, but a lot of the time that shifts because somebody will share something and then I will pull a prompt from something that they've just told me, and then we'll write about that, and then we'll have a conversation about how that's a representation of, oh, right here you're expressing some of the primal wound, and what that's getting at is this. And so we work through all of those pieces over time, and then they develop a habit for themselves where they can then start to look at their own writing and look for the language clues that are coming up and create a dialogue with themselves as part of their healing process.
And I feel you've just highlighted such an important point as to why you still need humans for support, because AI cannot figure out the questions underlying the human behavior to keep you going deeper into your process. You know, we can ask a question to get us started through ChatGPT or whatever it might be, but you can't, it doesn't replace that knowledge and that skill set that comes from being in with that person, with being sharing that space and seeing the beneath the mask of what's coming through. Yeah.
And the other part of it too that's so powerful, and I love that you brought up AI because it's such a big conversation right now, and so many of and like it can be useful for certain tasks, but it's a task, it's a task helper. It's not a replacement. And for adoptees, one of the most powerful things that happens when I work with people is that we become mirrors for one another. And I say to people as a coach, like, I'm here to be a mirror for you. And that's really important because we didn't grow up with any biological mirrors. But when two adoptees or three adoptees or 10 adoptees get into the same space and start sharing stories, we're all like, oh, me too, me too. And the shared understanding is incredible. And for me, being on the kind of other side of the mountain in terms of healing, I can say like, here's the sort of trajectory of my experience and my journey, and I can mirror that back to people and show them that they're going to get there. They just got to keep going.
Yeah, exactly. So well summarized and put, that you are the mirror. You need to be a mirror. And, when you find that support in a way of deep understanding and compassion, because people have been through that too, it's so important to have that community. And as we start to finish our time together, Dr. Liz, I ask people that come on the show, if you could heal or change something in the world, what would it be?
There are so many things, but I think if I could heal something in the world, I would heal all of the pain that so many adoptees carry, because I work with people all of the time, and every single one of us is in pain and it hurts me. And, I guess by extension, I would heal the need to separate families. Like we would just have, I think I would heal the rift around who gets to be a parent and why.
I read this book recently, and it was a fictional book. If I can find the name, I'll text it to you. But it was what ended up happening was the birth mother wanted to give up the baby for adoption, and went to the birth dad and said, I'm having a baby. I can't look after it. Here's the baby. And he realized he couldn't look after it because he was still growing. So he went and found the most loving couple to adopt this baby. But they still wanted him to be part of the baby's life so that they could have that integration, right? And be like, so they could understand it. And then what happened in this book was the birth mum came back and was trying to take back the baby from the adopted parents. But she wasn't in a state to actually look after the baby either. It was just she was suffering from that loss of giving the baby up for adoption, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, anyway, all these things just kept happening. And in the end, it was so beautiful because they found a way to work it that they were all still involved in each other's lives, but the main parents were the adoptee parents, but the birth parents were still involved. And it was just such a dynamic in what you were sharing of having that choice to not have that pain of not understanding, but also knowing that they're still loved. But the love was so big that they wanted to extend that love to give them the best upbringing they could. What a different perspective that was. And I had tears because I could feel. And then what I didn't know was the writer was adopted her own child. And that was kind of what she hoped could have happened, but she couldn't because that child's parents died, So it was like really beautiful in a novel, to see that that could be a potential beautiful outcome of having that connection still.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that the key there is the connection, right?
Yeah.
And being able to live fully whole and connected lives. And how do we do that? Right. And for a lot of us, we have to find our way there, which is why I do what I do,
Yes.
to help people to find a sense of connection back to themselves and then by extension to other people, because that has been taken from us. But there are other perspectives and other possibilities. And I hope that people will think about those.
Yeah. 100%. And if people want to come find you, Dr. Liz, to work with you, to connect with you, to read your book, where can they find you?
Yeah. They can find me at my website, lizdebetta.com. Super easy. And if you join my mailing list, I've got a great 30-day self-care journey that you'll get access to. I'm also always happy to talk one-on-one at any point with folks. You can also sign up for a chat with me on my website. Yeah.
Beautiful.
And you can find my book there too.
Awesome. Well, I'll make sure to include those details in the show notes as well as all your socials. So thank you so much for sharing your journey, Dr. Liz, and how you're now using that to inspire and bring people together in a sense of connection and community in a different way.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a great conversation. I'm so happy to have been here with you.
Thank you for listening to Willow Healing Matters, the podcast. We have so much love and gratitude that you have taken the time out of your day to empower you on your healing journey. The views shared by the person being interviewed might not necessarily reflect that of the host and should be used at your own discernment. Trust what resonates for you and follow your heart and soul guidance. If you have any underlying medical conditions or mental health issues, please consult with your healthcare provider before pursuing any of the recommendations. Likewise, you can always contact the person being interviewed to find out more information. This can be found in the show notes. Remember to activate, align, heal, empower, and find love in everything that you do.